Welcome. This week we do Parshas Vayikra. Next week is Purim, so I was thinking that I would say something about Purim next week. It comes just in the right time, Purim, because Vayikra and Tzav and these early Parshas in Vayikra are very challenging. so if I could spend a little part of the time to speak about Purim, it's very helpful. But this week I would also like to say something which relates to Purim a little bit, but it's not actually the central Purim. But we'll get to that afterwards. First, I want to say something about the Parsha. So the first pasuk in the Parsha says like this: Vayikra el Moshe, the Rebbeinu Shalom called out to Moshe, Vaydaber Hashem Elov, and the Rebbeinu Shalom spoke to him. So Rashi says, Elov. What does Elov mean? It says Hashem called Moshe, and Hashem spoke to him. So we know he spoke to Moshe. What is being added by saying he spoke to him? So Rashi, Elov, L'mayit es Aharon, that he spoke to Moshe and not to Aaron. Rabbi Yaakov Yosef Reinman said, Yud Gimel Dibros Nemru B'Torah LaMoshe Aaron. 13 times it says in the Torah, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe vel Aaron. It says both of them. U'kenegdom nemru Yud Gimel Miyutim Lamedcha, to teach you, Shaloi la'Aaron nemru ela LaMoshe sheyomer la'Aaron. When it says Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe ve'Aaron, it says 13 times Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe ve'Aaron, and 13 Miyutim in other places. And these tell you that when it says that Rebbeinu Shalom spoke to Moshe and Aaron, it means he spoke to Moshe, that Moshe should speak to Aaron. Veilen yigim miyutim, l'daber itoi, medaber elov, v'daber elov, na'atilcha. So the 13 miyutim are against the 13 places where it says Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe ve'Aaron, and tells you that's not what it means. It means that he spoke to Moshe, and Moshe was supposed to speak to Aaron. Question is, we find different places in the Torah. I only marked 2 places, but there are many places that it says. In next week's parsha it says, "Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemar, daber el Aaron v'elbanav lemar." So the pasuk says very clearly, the Rebbeinu Shalom spoke to Moshe and told him he should speak to Aaron. And then in Parshas Nasa we have the very famous one, which is familiar to everybody, from Birchas HaTorah, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemar, daber el Aaron v'elbanav lemar, kais v'barchos bnei Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom spoke to Moshe, and he told him he should speak to Aaron. So when the Torah does that, the Torah does say that when the Rebbeinu Shalom speaks to Moshe and tells him to speak to Aaron, the Torah is not, not reluctant to say this. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe, daber el Aaron. But there are 13 places apparently where it says Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe vel Aaron, and therefore I might make a mistake and think he spoke to both of them, and the Torah needs to clarify this with 13 miyutim to tell you it doesn't mean that he spoke to both of them. He spoke to Moshe and he told them to speak to Aaron. So why does the Torah do this? Why? What is the meaning of this? So I'd like to explain this with something that says in the Gemara. Now, usually I like to, when I quote something, I like to read from the text. To read from the text of the Gemara, usually for all these last few months, I've been quoting for the Gemara, but it really is not feasible to quote from the text of the Gemara. It's very long and convoluted. But now, if you will forgive me, I will quote from the summary that I wrote, which really is basically, it's not his Lashon HaKodesh, but it's what he says. So in Chelik Beis Perek Mem Aleph he says that in the Nevuah, the Navi sees a Malach and the Malach talks to him. In another form, the communication takes place in a dream or a vision, and there's no mention of an angel. The prophet thinks he hears his prophecy from God. Nonetheless, it is understood that the prophecy came through an angel. All nevuah, says the Rambam, all nevuah comes through a malach, except for the nevuah of Moshe, which Moshe was Pe'al Peh, the Rebbeinu Shalom spoke to him directly. All nevuot come from a malach. Now, when we learned in Parshas Vayikra, we spoke about the Rambam, what he says in the Moira, that the Malachim's visit to Avram was a nevuah. It didn't actually happen. It was a vision that took place. So we pointed out at the time that in this nevuah there was Avram and there was Sarah. Sarah was also a neviah, and she also spoke to the Malachim. So in the same nevuah, you could have two neviim. You could have two neviim that both are in the same nevuah. Avram and Sarah were in the same nevuah. Now, when it says Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe vel Aharon, then they are both having a nevuah, and they are both in the same nevuah. Moshe, when the Rebbeinu Shalom is speaking only to Moshe, when Aharon is not having a nevuah, he's not involved. The Rebbeinu Shalom is speaking to Moshe, and he tells him, go speak to Aharon. So then Aharon is outside of the nevuah, and Moshe will convey to Aharon whatever the Rebbeinu Shalom said. But when it says Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe ve'Aharon, they are both in the nevuah. Moshe is having a nevuah, and Aharon is having a nevuah. However, says Rabbi Yaakov says that this does not mean that the Rebbeinu Shalom is talking to Aharon in the same way that he's talking to Moshe. To Moshe is Pe'al Peh. Aharon has to hear from a malach. And who is the malach? Moshe is the malach. In the Nevuah, Rambam says very often that Moshe is called a malach because he's the shliach of the Rabbanan Shalom. So the Rabbanan Shalom could send Gavriel in somebody's Nevuah to give him a message. The Rabbanan Shalom could send Moshe in somebody's Nevuah to give him a message. So Aharon is having a Nevuah, but the Nevuah that he's having, he's hearing it from Moshe, who himself is hearing it directly from the Rabbanan Shalom. So these 13 places, Aharon and Moshe are both in the Nevuah. However, the pasuk, the Miyutim tell you, Vadaber Shemei Love, Lamayit is Aharon, that the way the Rabbanan Shalom was speaking to Moshe in this Nevuah does not include Aharon. Aharon heard it from Moshe in the Nevuah, hearing it from a Malach. Okay. Now, I'd like to say something global to the whole Parsha of korbanos. It's well known that the Rambam says in the Moira that korbanos, the reason why people have korbanos is because the Avdei Avodah Zarah had korbanos. And people are really upset about this because they don't understand it. They don't know what he's saying. So I'd like to actually over here clarify what is the sheet of the Rambam about these things. And it's really very, very important and very illuminating. The Rambam says like this. He says like this. It brings the two psukim. It says, Ator eis lodas ki Hashem hu Elokim, and vidat hayoyim v'ashavos el vavecha ki Hashem hu Elokim. It says the ikir is Yedias Hashem. This is the Rambam Shita Keseda through the Moira and in the Shmoyne Prokim and in the Mada Sefer Amada and Yisoda Torah. The Ikir is Yedias Hashem. That's what a person's life is supposed to be about recognizing the Rebbeinu Shalom. Be makir the Rebbeinu Shalom, to think about him all the time, to think about what he does, to get a hasoga. Of course, we cannot be masig the midas of the Rebbeinu Shalom, but as we spoke different times, or maybe more in the future, that there's a certain way that we can know about him. We could know what he's not, for instance, which is one of the Rambam's famous Yisodas over here. And we can know what he does. So there's a lot that we could think about the Rebbeinu Shalom. And that is what we're supposed to do. So he says like this. Should a prophet tell us that we should not pray, fast, or seek his help in times of trouble, but rather that we should worship God through our thoughts alone, we would find this extremely difficult. Long and deep contemplation on the knowledge of the divine is certainly a higher level of service. Nonetheless, people will find it extremely difficult to change abruptly to such a mode of worship. He says that people are used to praying. When you come to their gods, they prayed. When it comes to Ribono Shel Olam, when we daven to tefillah is very important, but there's two aspects of tefillah. This tefillah is avodah shebelevis tefillah, that we talk about the Ribono Shel Olam, who he is, what he does. But there's another aspect of tefillah where we're asking our tzrachim. Says to ask our tzrachim, says the Rambam, is a big b'diavad. And you understand this because if you're supposed to totally focus that Hashem Elokim Einoid Milvadoi, and you're asking your tzrachim, you're immediately creating two reshuyas, a separation between the Ribono Shel Olam and you. There's the Ribono Shel Olam, what he needs, what he wants, and there's me, what I need. And that be'etzem is not the best way of serving the Ribono Shel Olam. The best way of serving the Ribono Shel Olam is completely focused and to be mizbainen on the Ribono Shel Olam. But that's very hard, especially since people are accustomed to asking for the tzrachim. So therefore, we have that you daven for your needs in times of trouble. You daven for that. If you're truly on the highest level, you wouldn't ask for anything. You wouldn't think about yourself. You would just think about the Ribono Shel Olam. But that's not l'maisa. People need to ask for the tzrachim. They need to fast. What is fasting about? Fasting is again about yourself. It's not about this blindness in the Ribono Shel Olam. And the ikr is that is the ikr. This is what the Rambam lays out first as an example. Now he says like this. Now he talks about korbanos. He says similarly, same way. In those times, it would have been extremely difficult for people to abandon their accustomed modes of worship abruptly. Therefore, God incorporated rituals into the Torah that closely resemble those pagan rituals. The people could then perform those familiar rituals, but instead of directing their thoughts to the pagan gods, they would direct their thoughts to God. This is the purpose of this. Now, later in Chela Gimel Perek Lamed Beis. Later in Chela Gimel Perek Mem Daled. So the Rambam was a very big expert on pagan rituals, on what they did of the Vayikra. There are two books that he quotes all the time. One is called the Book of Tam Tam, and I've googled it. I couldn't find a copy, but the Book of Tam Tam, and the other book is called the Book of Nabatean Agriculture. And these books have record all the different customs that they had, and the Rambam apparently was quite familiar with it, and he quotes from it a lot. And this is what he says about how the korbanos, the seder of the avodah of the korbanos says like this: the Egyptians worshipped the Aries constellation, the sign of the ram, revered sheep, and never slaughtered them. Other pagans worshipped demons. They thought demons take on the form of goats, and therefore they refrained from eating goats. Most pagans viewed cattle with great reverence. Many in India do not slaughter cattle, even in modern times. Therefore, to eradicate these ideas, the Torah deliberately commanded that sacrifices be brought from cattle, sheep, and goats. The very act that pagans considered the greatest crime was transformed into the pathway to God and His forgiveness. Ideas are more effectively counteracted by the diametrically opposed ideas. By doing they revered the sheep, and we slaughter them. Then he says later, the custom of the pagans was to use only leavened bread for their rites. Only chametz they used. They also sweetened their offerings with honey. Therefore, the Torah disallows leavened bread or honey on the altar. The pagans, however, never use salt in their offerings. They never use salt. Therefore, the Torah commands that salt be used in our offerings. Now, I understand bris krus melech and all that's good, but the reason why the Torah chose, the Rambam holds, the reason why the Torah chose put melech on korbanos is to go lehedya, the opposite of what the pagans did. Then he says like this. The pagans considered blood repugnant. Nonetheless, they consumed it because they considered it the food of the spirits. They thought that by sharing food with the spirits, they would become conjoined with them and gain knowledge of future events. Some pagans could not bring themselves to consume blood. Instead, they would slaughter an animal, drain its blood into a vessel, and eat the flesh in its vicinity. They thought that in this way, spirits would come to share the meal with them, that a bond would thus be established, and that the spirits would then come to them in dreams and reveal the future to them. These beliefs were generally accepted in the pagan world. Now, contrary to the beliefs of the pagans, the Torah considers blood to be pure. It can even purify things that are impure. During the Avodah, blood was sprinkled on the altar. The role of blood in the Avodah was all about pouring it out rather than collecting it. Even in private use, the blood of slaughtered animals was not to be collected. You had to spill it on the ground. Again, all these things are to go exactly the opposite of what the Avodah Zarah did. Now, so the Rambam says, here, God in His wisdom allowed the people to be weaned away from the pagan cults by preserving the religious rituals to which they were accustomed while discarding the pagan gods they had previously worshipped. So this is what he says. Now, I have a footnote here which I would like to read to you, that the author certainly does not mean that the sacrifices are intrinsically meaningless, that they performed only as a charade for the mollification of reformed pagans. No, ritual is an important method of giving substance and expression to feelings and thoughts. We know this. Rituals are very important. Judaism is replete with rituals. Everything we do is rituals. Pesach is rituals. Purim is rituals. Putting on films is a ritual. Putting on tzitzis is a ritual. Everything is rituals. Rituals make the religious feelings concrete. God could have formulated worship rituals of any kind and infused them with deeper meanings and symbolism. He chose instead to use sacrifices because they would ease the transition from paganism to Judaism, and once He chose these rituals, they are infused with the holiness of His worship. So this is what He chose. He took the korbanos, which they were used to. He changed the very critical elements of them. They should be the opposite of what they were before. And then this is how this is how He brought them closer to Him with familiar. Okay. Now, then he asks the question. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but he asks the question. So why didn't he make that people should not need the korbanos? So he says that when it came to he didn't take the derech eretz plishtim because they were afraid and they'd run away. So therefore he took them into the desert. So Rambam says he took them into the desert to toughen them up. They should go through hardships. They should learn to have courage and to be strong. And then when they come to Eretz Yisrael, they'll be able to have the courage to fight. So he asks the question, so why didn't the Rebbeinu Shalom give them courage? Why didn't he just give them courage? So the Rambam says a very big yesod over here. He says, were God to have brought the people directly to a stage for which they were not prepared, it would have required a miracle. It is notable that in all the miracles chronicled in the Torah and the prophets, elements in nature are miraculously altered, but human nature is never miraculously altered. Although God has the power to alter people as He wishes, His will is not to tamper with human nature. If He wished to perfect people miraculously, the giving of the Torah and the missions of the prophets would all have been unnecessary. If He wanted to do nisim to make people perfect, so why did He have to give people Torah and mitzvahs? He could have just made them perfect. Torah says Rabban Shalom He does nisim in nature. He changes situations, but a person, what he is his own work. the Rebbeinu Shalom will not take a person and change his human nature. So since the people were coming out of the world of Avodah Zarah, and this is what they were accustomed to, in order to change their nature, that they would be able to be makabel, a new mode of avodah, which is different from that, and to make it that they would be able to handle that, that would require a nes. And the Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't do nisim to change what people are. This is what the Rambam says on the topic of korbanos. So what the Rambam is saying, korbanos, he's not saying that they were used to it, they gave it to them. Rambam is saying something very deep. He's saying that people, you want to take people and put them in a different place, and people can't deal with radical change. They need to go be transitioned. So you have to give them things that they're used to so they can transition from that. At the same time, whatever minhagim that they had, the pagans, he put into the korbanos the exact opposite. They took the blood and put it in a container. They didn't, because because the Torah is repugnant. He said, no, you spritz it on the mizbeach. It can be mitayr. Even in your house, you don't put it in a vessel. You don't collect it. You have to spill it on the ground. This is what the Rambam says, and this is how he explains the idea of korbanos. And I think if you really look at what the Rambam says and understand what he's saying makes a lot of sense. And it's not the way people think. Okay, I just want to say something about a little bit related to Purim. The Gemara says in Megillah, okay, I didn't bring a Megillah here, but everybody knows the Gemara. Come, Rabah v'shachta Rav Zeira. Rabah invited Rav Zeira to come to him for the Purim Suda, and they drank a lot, and Rabah got up and he killed Rav Zeira. So then they made a nest. He brought him back. Did he actually kill him, or was it only very, very badly wounded? The Mashal talks about that. But he did something really, really, a felony. And how does Rabbi do this? How does Rabbi do this? He's like, what is he like? He gets drunk. All of a sudden, he becomes, violent, and he says that, this is Rabbi, from the greatest Amiroyim. How does that happen? Another question is when it comes to talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. 24,000 talmidim died. Why? They were not respectful to each other. So there's two questions. First of all, okay, so they weren't respectful. Why did they die? I mean, since when is that a capital offense, not to be respectful? And second of all, how could it be that talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, and they learned by him, and they sat by his feet and learned by him, and they were so mushba from him? How could it be that they didn't have their cheres for each other? How could such a thing be? So I want to say like this. The Gemara all over has like Amiroyim saying very harsh things to each other. I think he doesn't have a brain in his head. That's what they say to each other. They say, Rav said this, he must have been asleep when he said this memra. What's with these? And Rahman l'Islam died to the dach. Rahman l'Islam died to the dach. I mean, some people try to give some apologetics, or maybe, but that's what it. But the Gemara says very clearly what they say to each other, and it's pretty harsh, So I think the pshat is like this. Rabban Kotler, famously, when he said his shir, and somebody would ask him a kasha which was like wrong, he would explode. Bur Amoretz, he would explode at him, and he got the, and afterwards he would apologize, but at the time he would explode. And you see Bismedrash, people sitting and learning, they're screaming at each other. Why? I mean, it's not, you see people who are math students when they talk, or scientists when they talk to each other, even if they're disagreeing and arguing. I mean, maybe it happens once in a yovel, but they don't scream at each other all of a sudden. Everybody screams. Why are they screaming? So this is really Rischa D'Oraisa. The Torah is like a flame. The Torah, I heard Rabbi Weinberg once said that why when a person learns these things, where a person is reading a math book, he doesn't sing. So he said, because when you're learning, your neshama sings. The neshama is singing. The neshama is also raging. When you're coming to Torah, the neshama is on fire, and everything that in the Torah, it's important. It's Geiten Leben. It's like, it's a volcano. It's a Rischa D'Oraisa. It's tremendous Rischa D'Oraisa. So, some people have it like on a very great extent, like Baron, and some people, Bachram and Yeshiva, maybe they see people behaving like that, they also do it. But there's a Rischa there. You're getting into learning, there's a Rischa there. The talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, Le'nogel Kavod Zeh B'Zeh, the reason why Le'nogel Kavod Zeh B'Zeh, because they had Rischa D'Oraisa. The Torah was burning in them. And the Gemara, that's the Gemara is saying. The Gemara is saying that they said, this is Rischa D'Oraisa. This is the Amoraim, the Torah is a raging fire in them. And when you're saying something which they disagree with, they will explode and they'll say, no, it doesn't. But it happens only rarely in the Gemara. And the Gemara records it. The Gemara could have just left it out. Why is it there? It's there to show you the Rischa D'Oraisa of the Amoraim, that they were, if you learn the Gemara properly, you understand these are not just a bunch of bums in a bar who are screaming at each other. This is Kadosh Elyon. This is the Amoraim of the Gemara. And when when it explodes out of them, such a statement, it gives you a peek into the Rischa D'Oraisa that's burning in their neshamas. This is why the Gemara records it. The talmidim of Rabbi Akiva, they could not control their Rischa D'Oraisa. It didn't just happen, sometimes it burst out a statement. But Le'nogel Kavod Zeh B'Zeh, all the time, they could not control their Rischa D'Oraisa. So therefore, if they could not control the Rischa D'Oraisa, they could not stay in this life and then go out and become Rabbonim and Rosh Yeshivas if they could not control their Rischa D'Oraisa. Rabah and Rav Zeira. Rabah and Rav Zeira. Who are Rabah and Rav Zeira? Rabah and Rav Zeira are Bari Plukta. All the time in the Gemara, you have Machlekes, Rabah and Rav Zeira, Rabah and Rav Zeira. They were Bari Plukta. They loved each other. They were best of friends, but they fought. They fought battles all the time, and they were Bari Plukta. But the Rischa D'Oraisa that they had was under control. Maybe sometimes they would make some kind of a statement, maybe, or maybe not, but it was under control. But they were Bari Plukta. On Purim, when it came time for the Suda, what do you think they were talking about? Were they talking about the chleisvos, what kind of costumes people are wearing? They were talking and learning. And they had opposite views in learning. And they got into an argument. And the Rischa D'Oraisa could not be controlled because they had drunk too much. So the Rischa D'Oraisa exploded. And Rabbah went and he killed Rav Zeira because it was totally uncontrolled Rischa D'Oraisa. But Baruch Hashem, he brought him back to life. Then the next year he invited him again, and he said, Lav kol shata Rachash Nisa. You don't have a nes happen every year. I'm gonna have shaychus with you when it's not Purim. Then we will have our pluktas. Then we will have our machlokes, and your Rischa D'Oraisa will be under control. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And Yetz Hashem, next week we will do Parshas and a little bit about Purim. Thank you.